Hmm. Yeah.
It's been fun. Challenging. I'm about to be at a year at MRNS from this month. Wow. Yeah, time really has flown.
So we've been, I don't know, I guess we had a discussion today that I'd be curious if there's any opinions on it. That so we have like a guy who's in college as a computer science major. He's graduating this year, and he's doing our like kind of front end JavaScript HTML stuff, which is relatively easy. And we're talking about whether to have him spend a bunch of time learning PHP and then Laravel and then our system to like be able to do that side of things. We're kind of like, we're undecided on whether we should take the time to train him to do all that or try to find an experienced developer to hire, which we try to do, which is hard to find, I guess. So it's kind of like, I don't know if we really even have a choice because it's just really hard to find, really good experienced developers who, know PHP and can learn Laravel and all that. So, I don't know.
Yeah, how Modernize is currently hiring, and I feel like as we start growing, we'll probably actually commit to this split. But technically, when I was hired as a full stack engineer, so doing both front end and back end. But I basically just primarily did back end stuff.
Yeah.
And any front endy stuff I did was primarily like back house call center agent stuff. So it didn't need to look pretty; it just needed to be functional.
Yeah.
But we're slowly but surely getting to where it makes sense to actually just officially be like, all right, full stack engineers are actually just back end. And we also hire front engineers, and they only do front end. If they have back end experience, awesome, great. Our expectation is that they'll only do front end work.
Yeah.
So if they want to and could learn the back end stuff, then I'd say go for it. There's value for training internally than having to hire.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely more developer than he is, design or the aesthetic part of the front end stuff. Like he's more the JavaScript than the HTML, but he's definitely a developer. But I guess it's mostly a matter of like, is it worth, we don't have to pay him quite as much, I guess, as if we had like a really experienced back-end developer, but he just doesn't have the experience, and I don't know. I just don't know whether it's worth the time. And I think if we had a great back-end developer with experience, for a somewhat reasonable pay rate, we'd probably go with that. But I think it's just hard to find, I guess.
Yeah, Modernize is currently hiring, kind of with a rolling software engineer position right now.
How big is the dev team right now?
At Modernize?
Yeah.
Are you including over QA engineers or not?
I don't even know how it's structured.
I would honestly have to look at the org chart because we just brought in we brought in another QA and a front end person in Monterey, and I think we have another person in Monterey coming on soon, and plus what's in the office. I would probably say 20 to 30 at this rate. And we're looking to hire 7 more this year, if not more. I know I have to dig up and find, but Cal Evans has preached the worth of hiring junior developers and training within to learn more skill sets and become more than a junior dev, just because obviously business side it's cheaper and
they're malleable.
Yeah, and secondly, they're malleable, and you kind of you get to train them to do the type of development and the processes and procedures and everything that you want.
Yeah.
And really, you only stand to benefit because they just grow and can do more than what they could when they started.
Yeah. It's also good karma.
Yeah. It's also, it really is a good thing. If you have someone that can actually preach that, I worked here and there was career growth. I started doing this and they trained me and helped me grow up to be able to do all this other stuff that I couldn't do previously. And that's a pretty nice selling point to when you're trying to hire more people, because it shows that they can also join the organization, learn, and grow.
Yeah, I guess so. But I just think, I don't know. At least when I think about the coding that I've done through the years I've done it, it just seems like it's like I feel like I've really improved over time, and it was pretty crappy for a while in a lot of ways that I didn't realize at the time. So I don't know. I think sometimes it can also just take a while to get up to really being as good as someone who has a lot more experience. But
Oh, for sure.
I don't know.
But
Yeah.
you also had the chance to like mentor them and everything too. So like,
Yeah.
you may not have like I know I
Take
didn't
less
have
time.
any mentorship when I started developing, and some of my initial code was just
Yeah.
god awful. But
Yeah, I guess it may be some of that, and also just at the time, I mean, PHP wasn't even object-oriented, for a period of time, and that didn't have frameworks for a long time that were like, really very good, and so maybe starting now with all the stuff that we have now, I don't know, maybe it wasn't my coding was as bad, maybe we were all not as good then, I don't know.
so PHP was rough.
Yeah.
back in the day.
Yeah.
So how does Cal sell the junior developers to people? Because of course management is going to be like, oh, but they're going to like leave once they finally hit their stride, and they're going to what they code is going to be like low quality, and
Funnily enough, I think he actually addresses that. Unfortunately, the last time I read his blog post and all that about it, I don't know if it was last year. If it was not last year, then it was like 2017. So my memory's not the best at it, but I know he's definitely written about it, and he does address your point.
but you don't remember how.
Yeah, I don't remember how. I think he more like my perspective on it is like yes, that is a possibility that you invest in them, train them up, and all that, and then they go somewhere else. But it's still cheaper and easier to train someone internally than it is to do all the effort for recruiting and job posting and like all the time spent for all the people that have to be part of the interview panel, plus the cost of hiring someone at the level you want. So do you run that risk? Absolutely. Is it necessarily a bad thing? It depends on your organization.
I think I'm totally behind more junior devs being hired, but I just wish that other people could sell it as well as Cal can, but that's kind of a tall order.
Yeah, no, Cal has a way with words that makes sense. I'm nowhere close to that. We almost had some DigitalOcean people join us tonight, but they had their plans changed last minute.
Are they they work locally?
They don't work locally, but they were going to be in town. They reached out and asked Eric and I, hey, we're going to be in town. Would it be all right if we talked about Kubernetes stuff? And I was like, we've got a talk planned, but I don't think it's going to take the entire 2-hour time block. So once it's finished, I would absolutely love it if you talked about Kubernetes stuff.
Yeah.
But then their travel plans changed. But they might be in town later this year, so not tonight, but in the future. And I'll see if I can plug the fact they're coming and do all the social media stuff so y'all will know when we're gonna have some Kubernetes guests.
I mean, in case you haven't gotten spammed with ads for this like I have, DigitalOcean now has a Kubernetes service.
I was in the beta, never had something that actually needed to use Kubernetes, so I never used and abused the beta, and now they released it publicly so I could use it, but I still don't have anything to build and actually push into Kubernetes, so I'm like, I want to try it, I just don't have a reason to. Without doing a very contrived, not worthwhile usage of it.
was my first time.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so moved to Austin about a year ago. And just started trying to hit the meetup scene a little bit more often.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I remember that's awesome. It's always really good. Yeah, for a long time.
How long have you been in Austin?
Long time, man. I think it was 12 years ago.
How long?
My brother was here after college and I graduated. So I'm currently in Dallas. How about you?
Just a year ago.
Yeah.
Well, from Miami.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
And we want to get a house, basically. My wife and I sit down in Austin, San Antonio, and stuff.
That's really cool.
In Georgetown.
Oh, yeah. That's nice.
It's just seen it change a lot in the last 12 years.
Yeah, that's quite a bit.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And I got married 2 years ago. Married early before it's changed a ton.
Yeah.
So I'm sure even for you, the year it's changed.
I'm already by day at least done.
Yeah.
I'm only going about half the campus.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm sure it'll be the new football stadium and
All right. I think we can go ahead and get us started. So, welcome to tonight's meetup. This is Laravel Austin, and in case you're not aware of where you currently are, I want to thank our sponsors for tonight, Modernize, for providing the.
8 p.m.
Okay, thank you Siri for that 8 o'clock alarm. Thank you Modernize for providing the pizzas and sodas and all that. I don't do this often, but just want to mention Modernize is hiring, as well as if you didn't see the comment on the Meetup site that Victory CTO is also looking for some mid to senior level engineers. So if you're looking for a job or thinking about looking for a job and you want to work with Laravel, feel free to chat with me afterwards and I can connect you with myself for Modernize or the right people for Victory CTO. Some back in the house calendar stuff. We've got the Austin PHP meetup next week. This is where I would usually defer to Ian and let him tell me what the meetup is, but he's currently at Sunshine PHP, so I did the homework myself. Next week's meetup at Austin PHP on February 14th. Love is in the air, and the love is for PHP. It'll be talking about deployments with GitLab 2019 edition. Logan will be going over all the tips and tricks for deploying things with GitLab, as well as diving into some of Google's Kubernetes engine stuff. So if you want to know things about GitLab deployments and Kubernetes, you should definitely check out next week's meetup. Next month, March 7th, will be the next Laravel Austin meetup, and actually, that date might be wrong. So my gut feeling tells me that date might be slightly off. If it's not March 7th, it's the Monday of that week. The meetup page actually has the correct date. Either way, speaking of Ian, he'll be presenting our final Laravel framework internals topic, all about the service container that powers Laravel. So if you've always wanted to know what that is, how it works on a pretty deep, intimate level, highly recommend being here next month.
The 4th.
Okay, so it is the 4th. That is, I said, there's one, I swear something is coming up soon for moving to Monday. So not next month Thursday, but next month Monday is when our next meetup will be at. So, sorry for the correct date. As for conferences, we've got Just PHP, February 22nd. It's a one-day community-driven conference. It's apparently supposed to be a lot of fun and funny based on the Just name. Highly recommend checking it out. We've got Laracon Online. Tickets finally went on sale between last meetup and now. And that is in March. It's like $25 for a ticket. Chris, could you this gentleman in? We've got Midwest PHP coming up in March from the 8th to the 9th. A lot of good talks are coming out of that, especially one of the speakers at Midwest PHP is one of the conference organizers and keynote speakers at Longhorn PHP. If you're unfamiliar with what Longhorn PHP is, it is a conference we're running in Austin. It's from May 2nd to the 4th. Myself, Ian, and a few other Austin PHP and Laravel Austin folks are putting the conference on. It's going to be a lot of fun. We've got a lot of awesome talks, including, off the top of my head, if you've seen the PHP stand static analysis tool recently, the creator of that tool will actually be coming into town and giving a talk about PHP stand static analysis and all the intimate details involved around that. So, blind bird ticket prices have unfortunately ended, but early bird tickets are still going on. So, buy your tickets, come to the conference, it's going to be awesome. That's all I've got for back of house calendar stuff. Let's go ahead and get right into today's programming. Hey, presented first time correctly. So tonight's topic, continuing the trend series of Laravel's internals, is the request lifecycle, the main thing that powers our web applications. So, starting off our request lifecycle. Our entry point. The entry point for Laravel's request is public index.php or index.php file. It really doesn't contain much code. It's only responsible for loading the composer generated autoloader script. It retrieves an instance of the Laravel application from the bootstrap/app.php file, and then it runs the application. And like the first action that Laravel takes is to create an instance of the application, basically itself / the service container, something Ian will be going into detail more of next month. From there, Laravel's run is primarily powered by the HTTP kernel. So the HTTP kernel is basically a central location where all your requests flow through. It's effectively like a black box that takes requests in and spits out responses with various definitions that power this functionality. One of those definitions is an array of bootstrapper classes. These are not immediately exposed, but they are something you can work with and modify if you so choose to. But these bootstrappers are typically responsible for configuring your error handling, configuring your logging, application environment detection, registering all your facades, loading your configuration, and loading and booting your service providers. The other thing the kernel is responsible for is registering all of your base middleware, or basically all the middleware that every request coming into your application has to pass through. A lot of these, like the base middleware, handle HTTP session data, if your application is in maintenance mode, CSRF token verification, and much more. But the main thing that your kernel does is this line right here. At the end of the day, your entire application is contained within this one line of code. Kernel handle request, which returns a response. It looks pretty simple, straightforward. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the background to actually power this. So one of the things I mentioned earlier was that the HTTP kernel is actually responsible for registering and booting your service providers. This is actually one of the most important actions of the HTTP kernel. If you're not familiar with service providers, these are basically the classes that are responsible for bootstrapping all of the framework's components as well as your application's own components. Excuse me. In the order of operations, first the service provider's register method will be called, and then finally the boot method. Register will primarily be used for actually like binding classes into the server container, and boot is used for, all right, all these classes have now been registered, let me do some like post operations on top of those classes. And then once the application has been bootstrapped, it's time to dispatch the request. And that dispatching is handled by passing the request through the HTTP kernel to the application's router. At a high level, this is straightforward. It takes in the request, it passes it to the router, defines the route or controller, runs any route-specific middleware, and then ultimately returns a HTTP response. But this process is a little bit more involved, so let's dive into the specifics. So, first off is the kernel pipeline. This is a look into, one, a class that's not documented anywhere in Laravel, but it does contain, and it applies to the pipeline pattern, which is nice because the class is called pipeline. Pretty straightforward, but this function right here is effectively the backbone of your application and the backbone of handling HTTP request. Excuse me. At a higher level, this updates the service container to bind the current request passing into the application into the container so that you can reference it in other places like your controller, any class you dependency inject the request object, etc. It clears any facades previously resolved instance of the request. So just in case any facades have like a blank empty request resolved into them already, this handles clearing that out so that the next time they go to fetch a request object, they'll get the correct one that was just instanced into the server container. Make sure that the framework is bootstrapped just in case you've potentially modified how Laravel bootstraps itself. This makes sure that it's correctly bootstrapped ahead of time. And then finally it starts the request pipeline. The pipeline class is pretty straightforward. The public API is pretty clearly written, so you create a new pipeline, giving it an instance of this app or the service container, since Laravel's application extends the service container. You're telling it you want to send the request, currently going through the application, through, this is where, if you're skipping middleware, you send it through nothing before actually going to the final destination. Otherwise, you give it an array of pipes or slices or however you want to refer to them. Basically, this is saying, send this request through the globally configured middleware before finally dispatching it to the router. Effectively, this is all turning into a giant array pipeline of closures. Dispatch to router is effectively a closure that actually just returns what happened after you pass the request to the router. So, we've gone through all the middleware. It's now time to dispatch the request to the router. This is a two-part process. First off is actually matching the request to a route configured in the application, and then running the request through another pipeline that actually executes the route's logic. So this is at a high level. This got a little bit scrunched up and smaller than I intended, but this is the entirety of the route matching function. The router is responsible for matching the current request to a route if one exists, and the router does this in a variety of steps. So first, the router will actually filter down the available routes based off of the method. So if this is a post request, for example, there's no point trying to match against the get, put, et cetera, routes. So first we filter off of that to just get the routes only specified for like a post. method. And then from there, this route, this match against will effectively iterate through every route configured for that method for the current request, checking to see if the route matches the request. Route matching in Laravel runs through 4 main validators. You've got the URI, the method validator, the scheme, and the host. So focusing on this section, those validators are basically, for URI validation, it will compile the route into a regex string. You don't have to write that, don't worry, I know how much everyone typically hates regex, so it handles it for you. And we'll match that regex against a raw URL decoded version of the request path. And if that passes, it will go on to method validation, which effectively just double validates that the current request method matches the configured route methods for the route in question. Since you can register multiple methods for a route, it just makes sure that the current request matches what's configured. The scheme validation actually validates 2 different scenarios. If the route is specified as HTTP only, it validates that the route is not secured. So if it's an HTTP request and you've specifically said this route is only HTTP, it fails. It doesn't match. If the route is secure only, though, it validates that the route is secure, as well as the request itself. And otherwise, if it doesn't match any of those, if none of those conditions match, it just returns true out of the box. And then finally, there's the host validator. Laravel actually allows you to register routes that are only available for a certain host. This validator just makes sure you validate against that. If there's no host validation regex configured for a route, it just returns true, it passes. Otherwise, it will actually compare the host of the request against the host regex compilation thing to make sure that it matches up and is correct. If a route is found, the current request is bound to that, which is this line here. I forgot to highlight that in this, my bad. Basically, that just makes sure that the route is aware of the current request that it's being processed for. Otherwise, we handled 2 other cases. If we didn't find a route for the request, we real quick check to see if maybe we do have a route for the request, but configured for a different verb. So for example, you try to call a GET request on a route that's only configured for a post. If we find that's the case, it will go through logic that effectively will, at the end of the day, return a method not allowed exception or a 405 HTTP status code telling you right route, wrong method. And then otherwise, it ultimately throws an HTTP not found exception. So we've matched the route. Now it's time to actually run that route with your request and get a response. So once again, it'll be highlighted in a moment, we've got another pipeline. That's right, Laravel runs a pipeline within a pipeline, and that's about as far as the nesting of pipelines goes, which is funny because the method is the doc block description for run route within a stack is actually says run the given route within a stack onion instance. So I don't know if that's an intentional Shrek reference or whatever, but I found it entertaining. But the first thing that run route within stack does is checks to see if the container has a alias bound of middleware disable, and if that returns true. If so, it skips any middleware configured for the route. Otherwise, it actually goes to gather middleware for the route, and when it gathers middleware for the route, it will actually sort that middleware based on a priority that you can configure in your own instance of the HTTP kernel. Effectively, that allows you to make sure that certain middleware is run before another For example, you may want to make sure like the authorized middleware is run before you do anything else, so you don't have to do like extra checking of like, is this request actually authorized for this route to do the thing, and it has all the guards, et cetera, et cetera. With a priority, you can actually just say like, all right, that's already been done. These other middlewares, I can just assume that's been done, and I can do what I need to do in this middleware. Making sure my notes are correct. Okay, I did screw this up. So, I just didn't delete notes from certain slides. So, after the request is passed through all the middleware and all that good stuff, it's passed to a final destination, effectively this closure here, that runs the route for the request and starts the response preparation. For route run, that effectively winds up in two different things. Either A, the route is configured to run through a controller, so that falls onto the application, building, providing all the dependency for the controller, etc. And then running through the controller method itself. Or if you just have like a route closure in place, then it will execute the closure, do all the things inside of it, and kick back a response. You'll notice that within this closure, passed into a method called prepare response is the result of the run and the request. Laravel does not require you to return a HTTP response from your route, whatever that may be. So either the closure or the controller does not actually have to return an HTTP response. It can return effectively anything to a degree. The framework still needs to figure it out to some point. But this prepare response method, at the end of the day, calls a static function on the router called toResponse, which is this giant behemoth that goes through a lot of checks. So a few versions ago, Laravel introduced the interface called responsible. It effectively allows you to, on any object whatsoever, implement this interface called responsible, which requires you to implement a method called toResponse. If your response, whatever object that may be from your route run, implements it, it executes and overrides the response's current variable with whatever the result of toResponse is. Otherwise, if you return a PSR7 response object that implements the PSR7 response interface, it will actually defer to Symfony's HTTP Foundation Factory and create a real Symfony response based off the PSR7 response. Otherwise, if the response is actually an instance of an elephant model and that response was recently created, the framework will handle creating a JSON response for you with a 201 status code. Otherwise, if the response is not an instance of a Symfony response and the response is an instance of arrayable or JSONable or array object or JSON serialized, or it is an array, it'll create a JSON response for you. And then finally, if the response is just not an instance of Symfony response, say you returned a string of something, either a JSON string or an XML string, I'm sorry, or whatever that may be, it will just convert it into Laravel's base response object with whatever content shoved in as is. And then it does a real quick check on if the status code is set to the HTTP not modified response code, it'll actually call a method called set not modified, which will just adjust a few headers and the content itself. And then finally, it recalls response prepare. I did not include what response prepare looks like because it is a lot of junk and nonsense that's just a lot of like backwards compatibility stuff and all that. Basically, it's doing a lot of like header adjustments, and if for some reason a response doesn't have an HTTP protocol, it fixes that, and basically it just makes the response object correct before continuing outside of this part of the pipeline. So at this point in Laravel's request lifecycle, we've bootstrapped the framework, we've passed the request through all the globally configured middleware, we found the route if it exists and executed the route, whether it's controller or closure. We got the response from that, we made sure it was converted into an actual HTTP response, and we have now delivered it to the client, whatever that may be. Browser, mobile app, other servers, execution over API, etc. Now it's time to shut everything down, call it a day, we're going home. So once we've delivered the response to the client, the kernel is responsible for terminating the application. This is the kernel's terminate method in its entirety. It effectively does two things. First, it calls this terminate middleware, which effectively just, with the request and response, it iterates through both the global middleware and the route-specific middleware, and checks to see if that middleware has a method called terminate. And if it does, it calls that method, passing it both the request and response. I don't know off the top of my head all the possible uses for having terminable middleware. I have used it a few times for effectively the same thing. For example, I'm currently using Now Modernize to power inbound request logging. So once we've delivered the response to the end client, we actually take the request and response and turn it into an array of information that we care about, log that information to a dependency injected logger, which actually passes that through Logstash, effectively at the end of the day into a Elasticsearch index, so that we can build out Kibana dashboards and reporting for what the inbound requests to our application look like. We used to use RunScope for this, and then RunScope decided it was a good business decision to stop actually providing this functionality, which is what a lot of people use it for, so then we had to build it ourselves. But if you ever want to call, if your middleware needs to do something after the response has been delivered to the client, this is the place to do it. Another example of that is closing up sessions, clearing out cookie jars, etc. that the framework utilizes within its own internal classes. And then finally, it calls the terminate function on the application. Slightly frustrating is that the terminate function is not actually on the container interface, and it's not on any interface for the application. It just only exists on the Illuminate Foundation application class. None of the functionality behind it is documented in a semi-typical Laravel fashion, but all this method does is iterate through an array of terminable closures and calls those closures. I have not found, out of a semi-based Laravel installation that is the modernized application, any usage of the terminable closures at all. So I can't really speak to what you would do or what would happen inside of this terminate function, but there is a method on the Laravel application called terminating. It receives a closure as a parameter, which pushes onto a terminable closures array. So my thinking of the usage behind it is it allows you to push on closures of basically cleanup classes. Maybe you want to, as the application shuts down, execute some sort of like metric class that
Yes.
gathers data like how long did the application take to process this request, and maybe it's time to grab all the query events that we were stashing somewhere and then push those off to some, I don't know. I'm hypothesizing at this point. But the functionality exists, the kernel calls it, and if you use it, I'd love to know how you utilize it, because I'm sure it's cool, and maybe one day it'll actually be documented or utilized with the framework out of the box. But at the moment, it's not. But after this is called, effectively your application's done. The last thing that happens in your public index PHP file is the call to this terminate method right here on the kernel, and then you're done. PHP FPM, Apache, whatever, starts shutting down and killing the PHP processes, and the next request comes in your application. The day's over. You've done the thing. So, any questions? Anybody?
Where do you configure the host validation rules? I've never had to do that. I'm curious.
So that is done in either your API routes file or the web routes file, depending on what type of application you're building. On the route facade itself, it's one of the various things you can method chain off of it to configure. I've not typically utilized it, but in the past, some of the examples I've seen is you can actually utilize that to do multi-tenancy applications. So if you're providing a service and companies can sign up and have their own company name dot your domain application. For example, for those of you that are Cloud Jira users, your instance is probably ours is modernized.atlassian.net. The host route validation would allow you to do specify routes for either the wildcarded star dot your domain dot whatever, or have routes that are specific to yourapp.com / whatever. So basically it allows you to split routes between the multi-tenancy application and the routes just powering your app, your base applications like pricing, about pages, etc., etc.
So at the end you were talking about terminate and using a terminatable middleware to figure out how long a request took. Do you know of any sort of out of the box things that would do that?
Built into the framework or packages?
Either.
I don't know of any packages off the top of my head. I didn't really dig into much of middleware. I wouldn't be surprised if, actually no, Horizon wouldn't do anything. But I wouldn't be surprised if Laravel Telescope utilizes the terminable middleware. I do know the framework out of the box uses terminable middleware for the cookie and session middlewares. That's how it either terminates the session for whatever session provider you have, so either closing the file system or cleaning up Redis, memcached database if you're doing that for some reason.
What's Telescope?
Telescope is a tool, we talked about it a few months ago, but Telescope is a Laravel official debugging, application debugging package. So if you install and configure it, it actually hooks into a lot of Laravel's internal events to provide you insight to what requests are happening against your application, any arson commands that were executed during that life cycle, or on the server, queries that happen during all of that, cache hits, myths, etc. They'll give you a way to view inside of a web browser any logged events that would have gone to your file log. You can basically see in the browser instead of have to go into the file system itself.
And it's free, right?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
free. You just composer install. It does the Laravel package auto discovery stuff, and then it's basically configured and good to go. You just go to your application's domain / telescope. I think the most you have to do is basically set up a closure in a service provider for authenticating who can see the telescope dashboard, and that's about it.
Cool.
I like ham-fisted set it up on a demo application when I talked about it back in December. I had mixed results on getting it to work for the application I installed it on, but I just don't personally have a, for funsies, personal project that makes sense to run it on, so it was missing a few areas of things I could show off.
All brand new installs, I've been able to get it going, but when I find these projects that are even on 5.7 and I try to get it going, I get all sorts of timeouts and issues.
Okay.
But looks really cool.
Interesting, interesting.
It's basically the official version of like a combination of Laravel debug bar, etc., etc.
Does it act the same like debug bar?
It doesn't give you a
Debug bar.
debug bar basically on the page itself, but it gives you a dashboard so that you could technically enable it in like production, for example, and be able to see like live traffic data and
And then if anyone doesn't know that URL, you can still.
That's not how you do security.
Yeah, no, I know.
You can password protect it with your
yeah, you can
off middleware and stuff.
with with the closure you can do any sort of like security. So
So the admins can get to this.
yeah.
But it also like adds its own tables, right? It starts writing its own data database and stuff. So
Which can grow out.
it grows pretty big.
Real quickly.
Yes.
Do they have anything in there to control that, like
Yeah.
delete after 30 days?
Yeah.
It does. The problem is when you configure it for your development environment, because all this data is super handy for development, and you fail to reconfigure it for production, and you're like logging way too much data.
Yeah. So you want to be careful with how you enable it and how you run it in production, should you so choose to, but it's definitely useful. There's the potential that Nova utilizes terminal middleware. I'm not as familiar with Nova. I have a use case for how I want to finally utilize Nova in an application. I just need to create more hours in the day to actually build it. For reference, the project is actually revitalizing the Laravel Austin webpage that no one knows about because I don't send any traffic to, that looks and is literally super out of date. It might actually still be in Laravel 4. Something, so it's very out of date, but I do have plans to upgrade it, redo it, specifically to outline the calendar and the ideology I'm applying this year of having mega topics or series throughout the year, like framework internals for these 3 months, testing, database, and front end, so that you can actually see like a nice highlighted calendar, all that fun stuff. I want to put Nova behind that so I can actually just add and configure stuff through Nova and not have to change code every time I want to do things.
You can just make an Android app to
Yeah, no, I'm not ever developing a mobile app. As much as I'd love to think high and mighty of our Meetup group, we do not get enough members or traffic to justify building a mobile app. Would be cool, but I don't have that kind of time. If you'd like to donate the time, though, we can work something out.
Just take out my time in a bottle.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to phrase it. I was really interested in that router dispatch. Like, if you were gonna try to do like an API that's got consumable endpoints, would you recommend adding to that method, or what would be a good way to like build out like common events so that like you could go in and do like Swagger documentation into your Laravel? Like for example, that 405, like would you recommend like building out like common like termination points there and then sending that to like this app terminate to try to get out of your, does it ever make sense to try to like engineer your app that way? Or is it best just handled by the controllers? Like Laravel just
I would,
instance it.
yeah, like, based on my past experience of briefly maintaining the Dingo API package, for example, which actually overrode and decorator pattern, the Laravel router, and all that stuff,
Yeah.
it creates headaches, a lot of them that are annoying, and since I'm still tagged on that repo, I still get all the good emails for the GitHub issues that get opened that I ignore nowadays. But for things like that, I would stick to more of your basically stick within your application. Utilize the controllers. I build middleware to tag into that, or utilize the framework's various events to hook in. Some of the things I didn't mention, because I kind of touched on them last month's meetup, was within the route dispatching and matching and all that, there's various event fires. Like for example, when a route is found, it will fire a route matched before it then actually dispatches it to the router pipeline that actually executes it, and then after the route's been executed and response has been generated, it's time to return that to the client. But before it bubbles up out of the kernel, another event's fired for response processed or whatever its specific naming is called.
So there's already good logic in the app for that.
Yeah,
Cool.
the more you start hacking on the router, the more headaches I've seen for that kind of stuff. Especially if you want to start hooking into your Swagger documentation and all that. As someone who's been in his very limited free time trying to build packaging that allows you to do a lot of Laravel stuff based off your existing Swagger docs, I'm still trying to figure it out. So that's the package doesn't exist yet. But
Nice.
any other questions? All right, that's all I've got for the request lifecycle. I sometimes forget to do this, so since I'm remembering to do it, I would now like to open the floor so that if anybody has, not just for me, but for anybody in the room might be able to answer, if you have generic Laravel questions, things you're currently stuck on, you're trying to figure out your application, or just curious about.
How much time do you have?
Somewhere. Well, we have the room for another hour, but.
Well, I have a problem. Migrations. I started off great using them, migrations, and then somewhere along the line, I'm like, oh, screw that, I just got to modify the database. So now it's all out of sync. Is there a way I can not reset the database, because I can't lose the data, reset migrations? Like, hey, go get the thing, create new migrations based off the database now.
Yes, so we actually modernize. Before I started, and for a few months while I was there, did not actually utilize Laravel migrations because it didn't start utilizing Laravel. So all its database changes were effectively managed by a repository that just contained SQL files, and after they were code reviewed, you, the developer, were responsible for effectively copy-pasting the SQL into our staging and production environments to run those. But also that meant you, the team of developers had to also find and figure out what SQL file they had to run on their local machines when they tried to run a request and it broke. For that reason, part of the project that I got tasked with shortly after I joined was moving us to using Laravel migrations. How we tackled that is, there is a package that exists. I'm hoping it's been updated since I last looked at it. I had to do some creative local composer hacking to get it to work with more up-to-date versions of Laravel, like 5.7, for example, like 5.6, 5.7. But there's a package that will generate migrations based off of your database's current structure. So you just give it the connection details of what to look at. You run an artisan command that's migrations generate or generate migrations, and it will run through all of your tables, generate the migration scripts that would create those tables, and then follow up with a list of migrations to add all the foreign keys. So you would want to install that composer package, generate your migration files, get rid of your old ones effectively. The next thing you'll want to do though, so that your migrations don't like explode the next time you try to run them, is you'll effectively have to like export and import the migrations table locally into your different environments so that all the environments are up to date on the migrations. You're basically tricking the migration system into thinking, oh, I've already run all these create table statements, I don't need to run them again. And then at that point, you're at a up-to-date current state, and then you can start writing migration at the top of it.
How many changes do you think there are?
Do I have to run?
Now, how many changes do you think there are between dev and prod?
Unknown.
Unknown.
Yeah, I don't want a lot. Yeah, luckily it's stuff that I did, so it's you know, I'm just like crap.
It's like schema structure.
Yeah, most of that, and I've just been using Navicat to like sync the structure, you know. So mostly, yeah, just schema structure.
If it's a lot, I'd go with 100%. I've done a couple things where, like, we had like a really big table where if we ran an index, like created a new index using a migration, it worked fine in dev, but if we got to production, it's going to take too long for like our deployment process to actually run that migration. So we had to like run it by command line. So what I ended up doing was writing the migration, and in the migration say, if the environment is production, don't run this, because we already ran it by hand. And then we ran it and deployed. It ran the migration, it logged it as run, because it was production, we didn't actually do anything.
Okay.
So another nice way to do that is you can, I don't know about indexes, but you can have statements that are like, you know, if this thing exists, don't run. Like if this table I'm trying to create already exists, then don't run.
Yeah.
I think you can check see if indexes exist somehow, I guess. But
Yeah.
What was the name of the package?
I think it might be just like straight for like Laravel migrations generator. I can't remember who's in charge of it, but I had to do some hacks because we're maintaining our migrations outside of the base application because the engineering team that works on the API makes table changes, as well as there's that alarm I see set for no reason. Our BI team makes changes to databases managed by the same system for reporting tables, etc. Or if they find issues with our transactional tables, they'll contribute migrations to fix those, like adding foreign keys that should exist but don't, or cleaning up duplication issues and adding permanent keys. So the issue I ran into was I set up the application as a Laravel 0 application, which was a newer version of Laravel components than what the package supported. And it's supposed to have been updated by now. I don't know if it actually was, so I had to basically clone them locally and repoint Composer and do a bunch of hacks.
I think MySQL Enterprise has a diff tool. You can get a version of that before you start going manual versus what you have now. You'll get a SQL representation of what's different, and that might help you write one more migration that'll get you to where you're at before as well.
Buy MySQL Enterprise.
What's that?
Isn't MySQL Enterprise kind of pricey though?
It's free.
Oh.
It's the client's free. I don't know about.
Are you starting Workbench?
Yeah, Workbench. Sorry. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I think it sounds like basically what Hunter was saying is you can use this tool, or like maybe even like write your own script that could automatically generate all these migrations. But once you automatically like generate all these new migrations, you need to actually read the migrations that were generated and make sure that they're
Yeah, I will say one caveat to migrations, which I kind of wish the documentation would point out in that package, is what I've noticed with like Boolean or tiny columns is, for some reason the generator, if you have a default set for those columns, it will incorrectly specify the default value and try to interpret it as like setting the default to a binary string. So then when it tries to run the migration, it explodes. And that's the only fix to that is basically just doing a folder level find replace of that binary string combination with replacing it with a true or false, depending on what the default value should be.
Is there an easy way to flatten migrations? Like if you have them in run raw SQL, but you just have a million migrations that alter tables, you know?
So combine them all?
Yeah, so funnily enough, this is something I thought about when I was working at Perk with you, and something that I'm sure will come up in Modernize once we get to a ton of migrations. The best solution that I currently have is effectively at some point in time, once you've decided you've reached like critical mass of migrations, is basically like resetting the system. So taking all of your existing migrations, deleting them, rerunning that generate script to basically generate all the create table statements in their current state in production, and then run your manual SQL queries to get your environments in the right spot, and then go from there. It's the cleanest way I've seen. Laravel's migration system does have a slight fault in it's entirely file system based. So if you suddenly have like thousands upon thousands of files, it can take its sweet time, like having to basically load every single file within the folder to then not run the ones it doesn't need to run and then run the ones it needs to run. It might have gotten smarter in recent iterations, but from what I've seen, it literally just loads the entire like folders worth of files from the autoloader and then runs the one it needs to.
Which part?
The actual like migration piece. Like it knows which migration files need to run based off of what's in the table already and what's not. But the only way it knows how to determine that is load that table's results, load every migration folder like, file in the folder, diff the two, and then go from there.
Well, yeah, because we create a branch and then with a migration, and then it doesn't go live for 2 weeks, and then in that time, 3 more migrations have been pushed to production. So how else?
Oh yeah, yeah.
How else would it do that?
Yeah, there's no better way for it to do that. Unfortunately, that means if you have like 1,000 migration files in the folder, you have to wait for whatever your server's I/O speed is to load all 1,000 files from the system and the class map to then.
With SSD, like 1,000 files shouldn't be that bad. 10,000, I mean, you have to. If like a Laravel repo can have like 20,000 like files.
Yeah, it can. Like, there's. It really depends. Like migrations is one of those things where it doesn't need to be super efficient because you're not running it on every application request. Yeah. So it's a one-time thing and you're done effectively, but it can still get. If you have enough migrations and if like your build servers are for example, are just not like the beefiest servers in the world, it can slow down builds and deploys for your migration changes if it's just basically got a shitty disk I/O and can't read everything fast enough. Because I think part of that reading is it will actually read the file from the system and also autoload it into like the autoloader so that it can then execute it correctly, even if it doesn't need to, which is here nor there. That might be more of a PHP restriction thing, but yeah.
So for the migrations, it doesn't just look at the file names, like it loads each file. Like, is this looking at the class name or something?
Based on the dates, right?
It's based on the dates are used for ordering. Like effectively the dates they can put into a file name are just to handle ordering on the file system. I haven't looked at the like, intimate details of the migrations logic and the loader, but the last time I looked at it, it knows the folder and it effectively just loads all those files into a collection.
Okay.
And then filters out based off of what's already run, and then.
So it's not like loading and executing the PHP. It's just just looking at the file.
Yeah, it won't load the PHP. It won't execute the PHP, but it will load the actual like file / class into your application as it rolls through.
I'm always so scared to create a new migration file. I'm always trying to like merge as much as I can before I scare the death of that directory.
Yep. We thankfully at Modernize we've been like we don't do a ton of database changes and really not even a ton of like table adds. Like really table adds only occur when we introduce a new product or product feature for an existing product. But yeah, since I wound up getting that implemented has been one of my projects at the company, so I'm constantly watching and babysitting it to make sure it doesn't suddenly fall off the rails. But, yeah.
My previous answer, sorry, it's in the MySQL Utilities bundle, which comes with Workbench. And I thought it was a GUI thing, but it's actually just a command line, MySQL diff. And you just give it 2 databases, and then it should spit out a SQL file of the diff. So.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a common thing. It's so easy to just modify a field in a table and worry about it later.
Yeah, and that's something so we're actually currently in the process of, now that we implemented like Laravel's migration system, we're working on implementing Laravel's Cedar system at Modernize. And while one of the engineers has been doing that work, he identified that there's like a column that managed to get out of sync with what's actually in production and all the environments and what the migration committee create, which was causing acceptance tests to fail. And I effectively just wound up writing a migration that just doesn't check, like, if this column doesn't exist and the column that was renamed to that column does exist, then run this change migration to do the rename, otherwise do nothing, so that whenever we deploy its changes and deploy the migrations, it will effectively do nothing in all the environments it needs to, but for new setups for like new engineers, for example, or if you just nuke your vagrant environments for the moment and recreate it, it'll eventually wind up in the correct state it needs to be in. But that works depending on the number of changes. If you have like hundreds and hundreds of column changes, that can be a bit of a pain in the ass to write to migration, but if it's a small enough set that you want to do the work to write in, like basically a conditional migration to only run the changes if it needs to be run, then it's definitely a significantly easier approach than dealing with pulling in a package and generating the migrations and all that stuff.
Yeah, keep going until the migrations are self-aware and sentient.
Yeah, that would be nice. And hopefully one day MySQL will finally support what MSQL and PostgreSQL support, where migrations table changes can run within transactions, so that if the table change fails, it can actually roll back the change through a transaction instead of getting stuck in a weird like Frankenstein half migrated state. Yeah, it's pretty awful. Anytime I've run into that, I immediately am just like, nope, screw this. If it's local development, just run migrate fresh and just nuke everything and start from scratch.
So how does that work? Do you say something before you run the migration that the database preserves everything it does so that when it errors, it goes to that step that you said?
It's based on the SQL server you're utilizing. So MySQL doesn't support running like alter statements within a transaction, so it just doesn't work. if you're on MSQL and PostgreSQL,
Mhm.
out of the box, Laravel does run your migrations within a transaction,
Yeah.
unless you specifically tell it not to.
And the transaction allows it to recover at the point before the transaction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
Those SQL engines are basically just built in a way that supports that. I'm assuming somebody's asked MySQL to do that, and at some point they'll do it. But then again, I saw a what was it? A constraint check or something that was requested back in like 2004 or something single-digit 2000s that was just implemented this year. So who knows?
This year in MySQL 8, which basically no one's using.
Yeah, because most everyone's running off of RDS, and unless they've updated recently, the version of RDS, or the version of MySQL 8 that RDS was supporting actually had a pretty significant bug that would require you to have to like reboot your servers consistently in a certain condition. And even though the fix was already deployed, Amazon was like, well, we haven't gone through our 600-month vetting process, so yeah, you can't run it through RDS.
Amazon's saying as of October you could. I guess it's still in the works though.
For
For
which version?
RDS.
For MySQL 8.
For 8, yeah.
Yeah, like RDS supports MySQL 8. I just don't know if the like minor version is the version that contains the fix for the server crash bug
Got it.
that people were running into, or not. Amazon is a bit slow with updating RDS, unfortunately.
Well, it's basically like there's just not very many people using MySQL 8 in general.
It's that, and obviously they're providing a product at the end of the day, so they want to provide the most stable, vetted version of what they've gone through. So their stable, vetted version they went through at MySQL 8 that they support on RDS, just unfortunately, as of like a couple months ago, contained the server crashing bug. Oops. Certain volumes required it to actually crash.
Is Laravel aware yet of 8 supporting this and will it run migrations and transactions?
8
now?
doesn't support the transactional stuff.
Okay.
Unfortunately not. 8 has, MySQL 8 brings windowing functions, the ability to finally specify indexing in ascending or descending order. A few of the things I can't remember, but also MySQL 8 finally comes with MySQL's built-in version of Mongo, effectively.
Okay.
MySQL 8 actually has a document storage
Key value
engine.
documents, yeah.
Yeah, so basically, effectively, like, before MySQL 8, if you wanted to emulate Mongo, you would just create a table that was an ID column and a JSON column, and that's it. Now the MySQL 8 engine actually has it to where you can create tables, which effectively look like the same thing I just described, just it creates it for you. Of an ID and JSON column, but it actually has like your typical document store APIs for it. Like there's even a new client you can run that has like your syntax of being like MySQL.document.find. If you give it an ID, it knows the thing. So
If you want to be able to roll back migrations, you should upgrade the Postgres. Is really the
yeah,
sensible approach.
if you want easier rollbacks and like fault tolerance, then MySQL's not the best, or you have to be very, very careful with how you write your migrations. Typically what I've suggested that you run them locally and make sure they can actually up and down before you deploy them somewhere.
So the thing is, if you're in MySQL, it's not like you can just snap your fingers and feed it Postgres. It's like
No, not even close. When I was working at Perk, our migration systems were also maintained in a separate application. So our migrations repos build process would actually run a test of running a fresh MySQL database, running migrations up to create all the tables, and then running migration down to tear everything down. And if those passed, we knew the migrations were working as expected. If either of those processes failed, then the build failed, and you had to go fix your migrations.
My experience with what you're looking at, the Amazon database migration service.
Yeah, I was going to bring this up.
I don't know about it.
Is it brand new?
It's some assembly required. It's the issue we had with it is that when we migrated, well, we were trying to use it to migrate MySQL to Aurora, but which is less of a change than MySQL to Postgres. But
Aurora supports Postgres too, right?
yeah, no, but MySQL compatible Aurora in this case, so not like even like a change really.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the obvious things is that when you migrate a column with an auto increment, it loses the auto increment.
Oops.
Yeah. Something messed up.
That's fine.
Oops.
What could
That's
go
not
wrong?
important.
What could go wrong?
Yeah. What do you mean everything's broken?
Yeah.
Just not like a little used feature.
Yeah.
It's like every day.
From the dawn of time of databases,
Yeah.
we had auto-incrementing IDs. What are those? Da 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 da.
Yeah.
Ooh, new shiny Aurora feature.
I'm seeing that MySQL 8 and 13.3 has, for the documentation, transactional unlocking statements. But is that not the type of transaction we're talking about?
That's not for
That's not
for altering tables.
altering schema. Okay.
Yeah, that's for like
Data, like data.
yeah, like
gonna be
insert.
So we'll wait for 9 in 2025.
Yeah.
Good.
Or it's David Stokes, or I can't remember. I think someone from Oracle that does the MySQL stuff is gonna be in town soon. He might actually be a lot more PHP. Basically, find whoever we can that actually works on the MySQL product and just pester the ever-living hell out of he or she until they implement it. I know it's been asked for a lot. I just don't know where it is in roadmaps. But what I've also gathered from the last 20 plus minutes of conversation is that when we do our database series of talks later this year, we should definitely do something on migrations. That's what I'm gathering.
I'm down for all the migration discussion all the time.
So
It's
I'll
always
have to,
the number one pain in general.
so I'll have to figure out a talk on that.
We could, in theory, though, right, in like the database driver, fetch an exception to handle that. Like if, and that could like circumvent what MySQL doesn't have right now. Like, so like our code could, at some level in PHP, in theory, catch the, you see what I mean? Like catch the error in MySQL, if like we could map that and then handle it, you know, somewhere.
And
down the
then
line,
undo
before your model.
the other stuff. It's not this simple because the thing is, so a migration, you're making like a bunch of different alters, and then like one of those alters fails, and then you catch it, and then what? You need to undo all the previous ones.
Well, it's a rollback, right?
No, and the
Copy the database
the
over, run it on
rollback, you
that.
can't roll back. You can't roll back alter statements in MySQL, only in Postgres.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess it's like maybe a bigger discussion then.
Yeah, like my uninformed high level would basically be the schema changes would have to snapshot effectively the create table
Yeah.
syntax before running the changes, and then catch any sort of failure when it's
Like,
executing.
I'm a big fan of like what you said you did at your last company of like, you know, building the database, building the tables, even loading data, checking like how service providers and models like all talk to that and having that as like part of the process. So the idea of like capturing, you know, like a failed create statement in MySQL seems possible.
Yeah,
It's one thing to capture, it's another thing to handle it.
Yeah.
It would be cool to get it into your CI that you detect something being touched in that migration stable and have some type of step where you run some test on some temporary setup with its own RDS or something like that. That'd be kind of a sweet setup. It'd probably take a long time as your database grows more and more.
Well, I mean, one of With our CI, as part of like just a test that runs every single commit, it will do like a migrate seed where it will like run all the migrations and then sort of create the database from scratch and then seed the database, and that sort of catches some amount of stuff in theory.
Right.
Everyone.
But see, there's the other issue is not always your test environment, because that's like a nice clean setup, right? It's always when it hits production and there's some existing data that conflicts with the altercation. I guess until your database becomes too big, you could copy it, run it on that, but only if it's like there's a check-in that's touching that folder or something. I don't know, thinking out loud, but
well, some people have their staging environments set up to sort of periodically mirror the production database, so that they can
that's always good.
apply stuff on that. We
Always
don't
better
have
than
that,
any
but
factory.
we don't have that, but I know it's like somewhat common use case.
Yeah, we're talking more about one of my fun projects at work, because I got tasked with basically modernizing our engineering workflow and modernize. The part of that involves like Docker and all that, and the kind of end game is right now we have master, aka production, we have a staging branch, which is staging, and then everyone has their feature branches, which effectively just live on their own islands locally and don't mean much until they get merged into staging. What that typically causes a problem in application development is you wind up with two sources of truth in your application, master and staging. The end goal that I have is that staging will not necessarily go away. It's just that there won't actually be a staging branch in version control. There'll be a staging environment, which will be Docker and all this fun stuff, but effectively it'll just be the master branch just running on its own database and data set, so that we can do spot checking things like what you're talking about, like running migrations against real-ish looking data, or making lives easier for our front-end development. So instead of them having to like run all this entire like Docker setup of our entire application just to make page changes, they can just have their front-end environment point to this staging environment, effectively a master clone, to make their changes but have the front-end application run. That is a good example of an environment of being able to like run those database changes against as close to real as possible data, and catching if something happens, like if the migration fails. Or the tricky part that we're running into is we, like very shortly after I implemented the migration system, we immediately ran into the edge case that we didn't have a solution, or we have a solution for, but doesn't integrate with Laravel's migrations for modifying large tables without taking the entire application down. I needed to alter a table that has 25 million plus records in it. That is going to lock the table forever. As much as MySQL's gotten better about certain changes, it was still going to lock things. So that hit that weird edge case where we had to basically trick the migrations into thinking it ran, but then we grabbed the SQL, the actual like pretend statements of what it was going to run, plugged it into a separate tool that Modernized had built way before I joined the company, that effectively did this whole song and dance of immediately grab the create table statement for the table being modified, renamed, because renaming a table is like an instantaneous action, renamed that table to name underscore old, recreated the table in place, running the alters on it while it was empty, and then it would chunk through the underscore old version of the table's data to reinsert, maintaining the auto-increment IDs and everything.
So everybody was reading off that table?
So
Or everything?
basically
Yes.
what would happen is, if you needed to read, like there was a brief moment in time where if you needed to read one of those records off the main table, it wouldn't actually exist. But new data could be inserted while the application was running. With basically, we would grab the last auto increment ID, add like X number to it, set the new table's auto increment to that to give us a buffer, and then reinsert all the old data through, like just chunking through it over and over, and then clean up all the stuff. It was basically a homegrown solution to various tools that Facebook, Google, GitHub, all your big companies with humongous data sets have built. An example of that is GitHub's Ghost tool, or GHOST, GitHub Online Schema something is what the acronym stands for. Those tools effectively do the same thing, where they create a ghost copy of the table where the data lives to make the change on the real copy, and then it will replicate the data back into the real table and then clear out the old one, so that you don't have to incur like hours of downtime to modify tables.
So with Postgres, since alter tables can be in transactions in Postgres, does that mean when you do like an alter table, it doesn't lock the table and you don't get downtime?
Potentially. I'm not as familiar with Postgres as I am MySQL, so I don't know off the top of my head. That's why I want to bring somebody in to give a talk on the differences between MySQL and Postgres and the reasons why you pick one over the other and their strengths and weaknesses. My past experience with Postgres shows a weakness of it's a pain in the ass to manage, but that was also self-management, spinning up your own servers and everything. I'm sure services like Amazon, Google, etc. have taken all those problems away from us. My last company was not as into the Amazon cloud setup of servers as where I am now. So I'm still learning all of the Amazon fun things and the not fun things.
Aurora serverless is pretty cool so far, except for it has that when you don't have anything touch it for a while, it's like 20 or 30 seconds to spin back up.
Oh.
Is that why you were going to Aurora? Or?
No. Aurora serverless is super new. I remember reading about like how they had plans for it, but I didn't know it came out.
Yeah,
Is it general availability? Is it general availability or?
Yeah, I think so. Pretty sure.
Yeah, that's pretty new. As for Aurora, so we just thought like Aurora was pretty cool. Like there's some new features, but we ended up actually not going to Aurora, and the reason, and I still have like Aurora PTSD actually. I've gone over this before, might as well say it again. Basically, there was a security bug in Aurora that was fixed in MySQL 2 years ago that we ran into, and it was causing the instance to just like hard crash to the point where we couldn't actually even delete the instance. We had to get, I had to like tell Amazon like, hey, I can't delete this instance. Like you need to delete it. It was pretty bad, and it was related to like full text things, like full text columns or something like that.
The full text indexing.
Yeah, full text indexing. Yeah, but like it would like hard crash, and it was actually like a security vulnerability from 2 years that was fixed in MySQL 2 years ago. That made me just like decide I wasn't going to touch Aurora for the foreseeable future.
Funnily enough, on services and deleting things, we use Google Apps like most tech companies do in Austin. We have a calendar event stuck on our calendar that is bugged beyond any sort of interaction.
The G Suite?
Yep, like we can't delete the calendar event, and we asked Google, and they're like, we can't delete it. Like, how? How can you not delete the event? You have database access. Just run delete from events where ID equals whatever.
The people you get, the people on the phone don't have database access.
Is it recurring? Are you like getting notifications
Yeah, it's recurring. Like it's forced something to be one on the calendar. The problem is it's bugged in a weird state where it shows it still has a room booked correctly, but for everyone else, it's not showing the room booked. So we'll have people book the room over our meeting, and then we're like, okay, I guess we gotta go do our dev tech talks somewhere else because Google can't get their shit together.
Self-aware.
Yeah, it's getting self-aware.
Sometimes Google just wants its own conference room.
Yeah. But
Delete the calendar.
I think the event lives on someone's like personal calendar, so we'd have to like
Delete the person.
yeah, we'd have to basically nuke the person or but unless anybody else had any like general questions, that's pretty much it for tonight. It looks like for the first time in a while we've gone through all the pizza, so we've got no leftover pizza. But if you would like to take home the Dr. Pepper or Sprite, you are more than welcome to. Please take it off of my hands. Next meetup is March 4th. It's a Monday instead of a Thursday due to scheduling conflicts here at Capital Factory.
Was it service container related?
Yep. Next month's meetup will be about Laravel service containers. So if you're curious as to how that works and how Laravel actually builds out the various dependencies your application needs, I highly recommend coming. Ian's given this talk a few times at various tech conferences across the country and other countries, so please stop by. Otherwise, have a good night. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I know you need to object.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Never use Laravel.
I figured that was going to be possible.
It's my first meetup that I've been
Are you doing anything for
Yeah,
this?
it's kind of the Kirsten actually working with AWS is that to learn about all the ways it doesn't live up to the marketing.
Yeah, that seems to be the thing, is like, it's announced in Vegas.
coworkers
and then
doing like
everything goes and
You actually try to use it and then you're like,
like, oh, give us a year, check an applesauce.
Okay. The other thing I really make sure is marketing.
Sounds good.
It's really and it's documentation and it's work documentation, so that means like that servers. It's amazing. I tried actually using it.
Have a good night, man. See you self-episode.
Yeah,
Yeah, you gotta go. Let me know. But I think you're
I've always been questioning.
And
here,
it like
that's actually how it works out.
it was very